Hello everyone, welcome back to lecture 12 of CPC by Dhriti Dharya. This is the 12th and the last lecture of this entire series, and in this lecture we would be covering the topics of transfer, restitution, caveat, inherent powers of the court, and also a small surprise segment which I'll reveal to you in a very short while. I really hope till now whatever we have covered is clear to you. There are no major doubts, there's no errors on my part even. And especially for the concepts of execution that we have covered in the last class, in the last two classes. I hope I was able to simplify the same for you and made it easier for you to understand. So let's start with today's lecture, but before that I would want to talk about a little, go back into execution, because I remember there was a small portion of execution which I had said that I will deal later because I forgot to add on the notes over there. We'll do that first, that is the cross claims and the cross decree in the modes of execution part, and then we'll go on to today's chapter. So let's first see what is the provision relating to cross decrees and cross claims in the modes of execution, where we were seeing where in the cross decrees and cross claims, first thing that you need to remember that there is a small difference between the two. Remember the rule numbers obviously for cross decree is 18 and 20, and for cross claims it is 19 and 20. In cross decrees, what are we seeing? That here it is not this amount of money which will be set off against each other is arising out of two separate decrees, while in cross claim it is the same decree. Let's see them in a little more detail. So cross decrees where there are for payment of money, they shall be set off against each other. If the amounts are not equal, then what will we do is that the full satisfaction of the large degree of the smaller amount will be done, and for the larger degree what we'll do, the part satisfaction is done by whatever that settlement is done, and for the rest execution will be done. Now in what conditions should be there that you will go for such set off in cases of a cross decree? Firstly, that the decree must be for different sums of money. They must have been passed in separate suit. The decree holder in one suit should be the judgment debtor in another suit, and each party should fill the same character in both of the suits. This was cross decrees. In cross claims, here there is set off of cross claims of what? In the same decree. So there are two rival claims by contesting parties which are arising out of the one and the same decree, which is sought to be executed by one party against the other. So this was a mode of execution. If there is a cross claim or a cross decree, the thing that you have to remember is in a cross decree there will be two separate decrees. In a cross claim there will be the same decree. You can also see the conditions, and the rules numbers are for cross claims rules 19 and 20, and for cross decree it is rules 18 and 20. I hope this is clear with you, and we can move on to today's topic. So the first topic of today is transfer of cases. As you all can remember, when we were studying jurisdiction part, we saw that if there are different places where the person the jurisdiction for that particular case or dispute is arising, the plaintiff has a discretion that he can choose his forum. There will be no interference either from the defendant side or the court side, and the plaintiff is free to choose his forum. However, this is not an unfettered power of the discretion of the plaintiff. It is subject to the superior court's powers of transferring or withdrawing a case. Now, why such a provision has been given? So there should be a balance. Just because the plaintiff has been given a discretion does not mean that he will choose a forum which will be hampering a fair and an impartial trial. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to balance between the discretion part and the fair and an impartial trial part. This is why this provision of transfer of cases has been incorporated. The court, what does it do when somebody has come before it that, look, I want my case to be transferred from this jurisdiction to this jurisdiction, or this court to this court? Court will look into the balance of convenience, of not only the plaintiff but also the defendants and also all the other parties involved, like whether the witnesses can be called to that place or not, whether the trial will be conducted in a fair or proper manner in that place or not. All these things will be seen. What are the nature of issues? For example, if there's a need of determining the mean profit of that particular property, and I am transferring the case out of the jurisdiction where the property is located, it will be quite difficult to go and ascertain the same. That is why in that cases, for example, the transfer of case might not be allowed. Now what we see that Now, it is not another thing that we need to see that whether it is an appealable, whatever order is coming out, whether it will be appealable or not. Obviously, it will not be appealable because it is not affecting the merits of the case. Just because there is a transfer or of a case, or there is a change of jurisdiction that is taking place, or change of court that is taking place, it has no effect whatsoever on the merits of the case. That is why it is not appealable, but it is open to revision under section 115. Now let's see some examples where transfer of cases has been allowed, like where there is a reasonable apprehension in the mind of a person that he will not be able to get justice, or this transfer is being done so as to avoid multiplicity of proceedings. Similar cause of action, same thing, another case has been another suit has been filed in another court, so he's wanting to get it transferred, all the suits transferred in one place only. Or if there is a high probability that the judge has a prejudiced mind, or he's biased in that situation. These are some of the many examples where transfer of cases has been allowed. Then let's see some examples where it has not been allowed, where just that the mere fact that I'll go and tell the court that the opposite party is a man of influence, please transfer my case from this jurisdiction to another. That is not just that particular fact won't be a ground for transferring it, or by saying that has been listed in such a court where the judge has already decided a similar point in a previous case, and so I know that he'll decide it in this manner only. Or just because the judge has made adverse remarks regarding the merits of the case, so please transfer this case. These are not grounds on which a transfer will be allowed. So this was a little brief introduction sort of, or some pointers in relation to transfer of cases. Let's see what are the sections that have been dealt under the code. That is sections 22 to 25. So section 22 says power to transfer suits which may be instituted in more than one court. Now here what you are seeing, first thing that you can see from the heading itself, that what suits which can be instituted in more than one court. So any of the defendants, what can they do? They'll give notice to all the parties at the earliest opportunity, and in all cases where the issues have been settled or before such settlement, it will apply to the court that please transfer it to the another court. And the court to whom such application has been made, what will it do? It will consider all the objections that are there from the other party. If they are making any such objections, it will determine in which of the courts which has the jurisdiction this particular suit will proceed. So section 22 is saying that the court has a power to transfer suits which may be instituted in more than one suit. Then what does section 23 say? Now I understood that yes, you have a power to do that. Now which court should I go to with my transfer application? So if, for example, all these courts which have the jurisdiction are subordinate to a particular appellate court, then I will go to that appellate court. Now if these courts that have jurisdiction are subordinate to different appellate courts, but all of these courts are subordinate to a particular high court, then I will go directly to that. But in a situation where all these courts which have the jurisdiction, the high courts are also different, then we'll go to that high court where in whose local limits the suit was brought first. That would be the forum where we will take the transfer application. Then what we'll see, what is section 24? Section 24 is talking about the general power of transfer and withdrawal. Now when any of the parties is applied, then you'll send notices and then hear them, or on its own motion the court can do without giving any notice. Which court? The high court or the district court. At any stage, what can they do? They can either transfer any suit, appeal, proceeding which is pending before it or for trial or disposal to any competent court subordinate to it, or they may withdraw any of the same in any of the court subordinate, or they'll try it itself or dispose it off, or it will send to another subordinate court competent to try and dispose of the same, or it will retransfer back that particular withdrawn case or suit or a proceeding, appeal, etc., and send it back to the court from where it was taken. And wherever any transfer or withdrawal has been done, court will then after try the suit or to dispose of such particular suit or proceeding subject to whatever special directions has been given by that court, and there will be either retrial or they'll be proceeding from the same point of transfer or withdrawal has taken place. Now for this particular section, you have to also understand that additional and assistant judges are subordinate to the district court. Proceedings under here includes execution proceedings of order and a decree. Now, if there is a court which was trying, if this transfer of withdrawal has been done from a court of small causes, then the court which will be now trying the same will also be deemed to be taken as a court of small causes. Now, suit or proceeding may be transferred from a court which has no jurisdiction to try it. So this was the general part. Here, general part of transfer and withdrawal, where we saw the two modes, either on the application of the party and then sending notices to them and hearing them, or on its own motion without sending them by the High Court or the District Court. What are they doing? Either they will transfer it and try or dispose it of, or withdraw of any of it, then they'll try or dispose it of, or send it to another court, or they transfer it back to the court from which it was done, and they can give special directions also, etc. This was section 24. Then let's see section 25. What is happening in section 25? Section 25 is talking about the power of the Supreme Court to transfer suits, etc. Now here there is an app on the application of the parties where the notice will be given, hearing will be done, and the Supreme Court has its own discretion that at any stage, if it feels that it is required for what? The ends of justice, will direct transfer from a high court or a civil court of one state to a high court or a civil court of another state. Every such application shall be made by a motion supported by a affidavit, and the court to which it will be transferred will be subject to all the special conditions that have been put by the Supreme Court. It will either retry it or it will proceed from the point of transfer or withdrawal. Now, if somebody has made such an application and the court feels that this was a frivolous or a vexatious application, to dismiss it and also order payment of compensation to the person who has opposed such a transfer application, and the sum would be not exceeding 2,000 rupees as it considers appropriate. And what law will be applicable when such transfer has been made? It will be applicable that whichever law where the first time that particular suit, appeal, or proceeding was originally instituted would have applied that, with that court would have applied, that law would only apply in this case. So this was all about transfer, where we saw sections 23 to 22 to 25, where we first saw that yes, there is a power to transfer suit which may be instituted in more than one court. Then in 23 we saw in which court such an application will lie. Then we saw in the 24 the general power of transfer and withdrawal on application or on its own motion, how they'll transfer, how they'll withdraw, what can be done, what will we do by doing so, what kind of, who is considered subordinate to whom, and all of that. Section 25, where we saw the power of the Supreme Court to transfer the suits. This was topic number 1, transfer of cases. Let's move on to the next topic, that is restitution. Now, yet again, like a lot many other things, restitution has also not been defined under the code. But in simple terms, we can understand that it is an act of restoring a thing to its proper owner. You are restoring a thing, you're not giving it to someone, you are restoring it back. So what is it based on? What is the principle behind such a provision? That anybody who has unjustly benefited from something should make restitution to the party who has lost it. Like you are trying to place that person in the same position that he was before. As much as possible. It might not be possible to put him in exactly the same position, but you must try as much as possible bring him back to the original position only. And section 144 does not in any way confer any substantive right, but it is merely regulating the power of the court in this behalf. And what is it based on? The maxim. It is based on the maxim that an act of court shall harm no one. So it is based on the equity principles and also the theory of unjust enrichment. And if you can remember, whatever order decree comes here would be taken as a deemed decree under section 2 clause 2, and also the moment it becomes a decree, we know unless otherwise stated it becomes appealable, so it is an appealable. So whatever order happens, whatever decree is coming out here will be appealable. And who is this restitution granted to? It will be obviously granted to a party which includes its beneficiaries also, and against whom any party to a litigation or their legal representatives. Now, just this jurisdiction to grant restitution is not restricted to only the cases that have been covered by section 144. It covers all the cases that are there. So what are the certain conditions that you have to keep in mind before restitution can be ordered? Firstly, it must be in respect of a decree or order which has been reversed or modified, and the party who is applying for restitution must be entitled to the benefit of for the same, and the relief claimed must be properly consequential on reversal or variation of the order or decree. Now you'll understand here is that what has happened here is there was previously a decree or an order by which somebody got some property. I had to give some property to somebody. But later on, an appeal or something else or a revision or any kind of proceeding, same decree was reversed or modified or varied. What happens? This is the first condition. Then what happens? Obviously, because it was modified, I did not, because it is now varied and modified, I need not have given by that particular thing to that person. I lost something, and he has now he has now been unjustly enriched by that property. I'm still suffering because of it, so I should get that back. So now I will go and apply to the court that I'm entitled to such a benefit because that order on the basis of which I had to give that property is now reversed, and this relief that I am claiming of restitution should be consequential on the reversal or the variation of the decree or the order. So let's see section 144, which is dealing with the application for restitution. What does it say? Let's go into it. So it is saying wherever there is any order or decree which has been varied, reversed in what? In an appeal, revision, or any other proceedings, or has been set aside or modified in any other suit which was instituted for this purpose, the court which had passed the decree or order will, on the application of the party who is entitled to the benefit by restitution otherwise, will cause such restitution to be made, so that the parties may be put in a position that they would have occupied but for that first decree or order which has now been modified, varied, reversed, etc. And for this purposes, the court will not only order restitution, but they can also order refund of costs, payments of interest, damages, compensations, mean profits, etc., whichever is properly consequential on such reversal or a variation of the order or the decree. Now this, I hope you have been able to understand that there was one decree order which was later reversed, etc. So whatever, I have to be put back into the position where I was before that particular order or decree was passed. So that is why the court can give me restitution, and not only restitution, but it can also give me costs, payments of interest, damages, compensations, etc. And let's see some of the explanations that are under this section. That for this section, what do we mean by court which passed the decree? A court which passed the decree means if there is a variation or a reversal in an appellate or the revisional jurisdiction, the court which passed the decree would mean the court of the first instance. Now, if this particular decree that was passed was set aside in a separate suit, then the court of first instance which had passed the order or decree will become the court which passed the decree. Where the first instance court has ceased to exist or has no jurisdiction to execute, now that court, where at the time of making the restitution application, that court which would have the jurisdiction to try the suit, there you can go for applying for restitution. Now, no separate suit for getting your restitution or any other relief should be done, for which you can file an application under this section. So this was about section 144, that is restitution. I hope you were able to understand what are the principles on which it is based. It is based on equity principles, unjust enrichment, that if somebody has got an unjust benefit, obviously he needs to give it back. Like an act of court should not be harming someone. Just because a court has erred in a particular making an order and that order is now reversed, so obviously that particular person who was not required to give that property or anything else should be given that back. And it is an appealable, it is a deemed decree, it is an appealable one, and jurisdiction to grant restitution is not just confined to these cases covered by 144, but to all the cases that are not even covered here. And you can see the conditions. You have to always remember that the decree or order that now reversed, modified, or set aside in a separate suit, in appeal, revision, or any other proceedings, party entitled will come on an application, restitution will be made, cost, payment, compensation, damages, interest, etc. also may be given. Which court will be taken as a court which passed the decree is being given under the explanation. I hope this is clear. Now let's now move on to the third topic, that is caveat. Now, caveat has not yet not been defined, but it is a Latin term which translates into beware. So caveat is sort of a caution that you're giving to the court. Like, I'm a party, I'm giving a caution to the court that, look, please do not proceed in such and such case, or proceed to give relief to a certain person without noticing me or without hearing me. What I'm trying to do with the help of a caveat, I'm trying to safeguard a particular person's interest against an order that may be passed on an application by a party in a suit or a proceeding in a suit to instituted or to be instituted, and to avoid multiplicity of proceedings. Like, I have an interest in that particular suit matter, but I'm not a party to it as such. And if somebody has made an application on which some particular relief is being granted, I'm not heard, and it will affect me also. So I'm telling the court that please beware and listen to me before you grant such a relief. And by doing so, what also we are doing, we are also reducing the multiplicity of proceedings. Like, for the same issue, why to have three many suits, like 2 or 3 suits, when we can do it in one suit only. And you can remember that the caveat was introduced by the 1976 amendment. Now, who can file a caveat? A caveat will be filed by a person who claims a right to appear before the court on the hearing of such an application. And a caveat can be understood as a condition precedent, that before you pass an interim order, it is your duty to hear me. It is a condition precedent before you can give any relief. So let's see section 148A, which talks about who has the right to lodge a caveat. Now, where there's an application which is expected to be made or has been made, this means that it does not mean that the application should already have been made. Even if there's an anticipation that such an application might be made before the court, you can go and file a caveat in a suit or a proceeding which has been instituted or is about to be instituted. You can see that it's not just for an already instituted suit or proceeding, but for one which can be instituted also in a court. Any person who claims that he has a right to appear on hearing of such an application can lodge a caveat in that effect. I hope this is understood. The application can be already made or is expected to be made. In what? In a suit which has already been instituted or is about to be instituted. Suit or proceeding which is instituted or about to be proceeding, that any person who claims a right to appear at the hearing of such an application may lodge a caveat. Now, if the caveat has been lodged, then the caveator will serve a notice of the caveat by registered post acknowledgement due on the person on whom the application has been, the application who is making the application or who is expected to make that application. Now, after a caveat has been lodged and an application is filed, for example, like if a caveat has been lodged, I have lodged a caveat, I knew that somebody is going to file an application in relation to a particular property matter in which I am interested. I have already lodged my caveat. I have lodged my caveat in the court, and I'm waiting. And one application actually gets filed. What will the court do? The court will ensure that I get a notice of the application, and when I have of the application. And what did you see before? When I had filed the caveat, I was required to serve a notice of the caveat to the person to whom who would have been filing the application. Now, when the notice of a caveat has been served on the applicant, he will send to the caveator on his caveator's expense a copy of the application, all the documents, papers, etc., which he is going to file in support of the application. And there's another thing that you have to see, that the caveat will not remain in force for more than 90 days from the date it was lodged, unless in the midway an application has been made before the court before this 90-day period expires. I hope you could understand what is a caveat. Let's just try and rewind it once. Caveat, literally trying to beware the court that before you proceed to give any relief, please hear me. You're safeguarding the interest of the person. You are trying to reduce the multiplicity of proceedings, and this was how was it introduced by the 1976 Act, and it can be understood as a condition precedent also. And section 148A is a right to lodge caveat whenever the application is made or is expected to be made in a suit or proceeding instituted or expected to be instituted. You can lodge a caveat. If you have lodged a caveat, you're required to send a notice of the caveat to the applicant. If a particular caveat has been lodged and an application is filed later, the court will ensure that a notice of the same is given to you. If a caveat has been served to an applicant, then a notice of that caveat has been served to an applicant, then that person will be required on the caveator's cause to furnish to the caveator a copy of the application, all the papers, documents on which he is supposed to rely, etc., all will be given, and the time limit is for 90 days unless an application is filed in the between. So let's now move to inherent powers of courts. So under inherent powers of courts, we can first understand that what is CPC. We know it's a procedural law, adjective law. We try to construe its provisions liberally. We try to, by using it, we'll try to advance justice, facilitate justice, further its ends. Now, what are these inherent powers? They are complementary to all those powers which have been specifically put in the court and has been conferred on the courts. Because we know that the code is not possible, that you can write all the possible situations or situations that may be arising, all the circumstances that may be arising. You cannot write all of that, and you cannot make a very exhaustive code. This is why we are dealing with inherent powers of the court. Now, this inherent powers of the court is not given by the legislature to the court. It is inherently there in the court. Why? Because of its duty to do justice between the parties. Nobody is conferring the court that power. The court already has it. And what are we doing? So the court will exercise it in absence of express provisions. Like, you have to understand, the court will not run to go and use its inherent powers if there's already an express provision, or by impliedly you could understand that yes, the law is saying such and such thing. Only if there's an absence will the court resort to its inherent powers. So you have to use it sparingly, and will not be used if there's an inconsistency or there's a conflict with the other parts which are expressly given by the code, or by necessary implications you can understand that the code has written there. So these are like restrictions. Like, for example, if the court has said that you do not have a jurisdiction in such and such matter, for example, a court of small causes cannot hear cases of value more than rupees 10,000. But just by using inherent power of courts, the small causes cannot start listening to 1 lakh valuation cases. So you have to understand that kind of a limitation even. Like, for example, or the court says that no, I feel injustice has been done in a certain case. So something that is barred by res judicata, it has become final, conclusive, everything, you go and reopen and start listening to that case. So this is also where you cannot use the inherent powers of the case. Now let's see the various sections that are there under the code which deals with the inherent parts of the case. First one is section 148, enlargement of time. In simple words, we can understand, like, the code has given particular time frames. A lot of places you've seen 90 days, 60 days, 15 days, 7 days. Lot of time frames have been given. Now what happens after the extension period, etc., is also gone. Here under 148, the court has its discretion that it can enlarge such a period, even though the period cannot exceed 30 days in the totally originally fixed or granted period. Even though for 30 days more, the court can enlarge that time. Now this, firstly, before using section 148, the court will see whether this particular period, whatever time period has been granted, is fixed or has been granted by the court, and this particular thing was for doing an act which was allowed or prescribed by the court. Only if these two conditions, that the period must be fixed or granted by the court and it is for doing an act prescribed or allowed by the court, that section 148 can be used, and obviously it is a discretionary power of the court. Then section 149 is a power to make up the deficiency of court fees. Now, you know, if the court fees has not been paid, you are not allowed to proceed, etc. So court has a discretion that at any stage where there has been deficiency as such, it may allow you to pay. Okay, you have proceeded and it is found out that you did not pay a particular amount of court fees, so proceeding will not proceed. Here the court will allow you to pay the same, and it will be taken as if the fees was paid at the first instance only. Like, it is kind of a retrospective validation for that particular proceeding or for a document for the purposes of limitation and court fees. Here what we are seeing in section 151, which is a saving clause, that nothing which has been written in the code will deem to limit or anything otherwise the inherent power of the court for doing what? For making any orders two purposes, which is necessary for the ends of justice or to prevent the abuse or the process of the court. Remember these 2 points, because a lot of times you can get in MCQs that what are the 2 situations in which the court will exercise the powers under section 151. You get options like ends of justice or preventing abuse of process of court, etc. So this is This is the main crux where we'll be talking about the inherent powers of the court. Like the court can recall its own order and correct its own mistake. It can give temporary injunctions in situations which are not covered under Order 39. It can add, delete, or transpose any party to a suit, etc. It will help preventing abuse of a court, like in situations where somebody has practiced fraud in the court. So this was 151. It is a saving clause. It is recognizing the inherent powers of the court, that they can, for the ends of justice and to prevent the abuse of the process of the court, can pass certain orders which may have not been contemplated under the act. But please remember all the limitations that have been given up. Now here you, when you read criminal law, you can contrast it. Section 482, if I'm not wrong, of CRPC talks about similar powers of the High Court. In civil law, in the CPC, this inherent power is with all the civil courts, not just the High Court. While in criminal law, that particular power is only with the High Court. Please remember this distinction. Then let's move on to 152, which is talking about amendments of judgments, decrees, or orders. So if any clerical or arithmetic error, which was happened in the particular judgment, decree, or order by accidental slip or omission, court on its own motion or an application of the parties can the same. What is the principles on which it is based? That an act of court should not prejudice anyone, and the records of a court should be correct and should represent the correct state of affairs. Then 153 is a general power of amending. So court can at any time, at such cost or whatever that it deems fit, can amend any defect or error in any proceeding and make all necessary amendments for that purpose to determine the real issue or the issues raised by or depending on such a proceeding. Now, this general power of amending, like the court can any time can amend any defect or error in any proceeding in a suit. You contrast it with 152. 152 was only for judgments, orders, and decrees where you can amend it only arithmetic and clerical errors. Order 6, Rule 17, where you could amend the pleadings. And 153 is a general power to amend any kind of pleading, any proceeding. Then we can see 153A, power to amend decree, order where appeal is summarily dismissed. Now, if it has been dismissed summarily under this particular order, the power to amend under section 152 may be exercised by the court of first instance, even though the dismissal of the appeal will have the effect of confirming the decree or the order passed by the court of first instance. In simple words, if there is a summary dismissal and that it does summary dismissal of an appeal, so obviously that means that the decree or order has been now been confirmed, but still the court which had first passed that particular decree or order can exercise section 152 to amend its judgments, order, or decree, even though it seemed by that dismissal it has now been confirmed. So this was dealing with inherent parts of the code, where you can understand that despite all those that has been written in the code being so exhaustive, so beautifully written, and etc., still they cannot all situations can be dealt with. So there are certain things that have been left to the inherent parts, and some examples were section 148, 149, 151, 150, 153A, 152 also, and you can go through them. 151, please remember the 2 points of ends in justice and preventing the abuse of the court. Remember the contrast between the criminal law, etc. And this is all that is there. And you can also go through the miscellaneous part 11. You can see the leftovers. So with this, we have come to the end of CPC. I hope through these 12 lectures, I was able to help you out in dealing with the entire provisions, in understanding the logic behind the provisions, and understanding the flow of these provisions, that you need to be so baffled with the distinctions between the orders and the sections, etc. That it is, and try to make a little bit of sense out of the chaos that CPC seems to be. I hope I have been able to help you with all of that. So in order to supplement it a little more, I added a little small surprise segment, that is, how would you use these particular notes for writing answers? I know for any judicial exam, for any exam which has this prelims, means, and interview pattern, just clearing the prelims won't be enough. So I really wanted it to be a little more than that. I did not want it to make a code specifically for prelims only. I wanted that at least I can help you comprehensively and holistically cover this particular subject. So I've added this particular segment that I'll show you that by this condensed notes how you can also write mains answers. So for this we'll take an example of a question that had come in the 29th Bihar judicial exam, that is, explain the relevancy of foreign judgments in Indian courts. Can we implement the foreign judgments? State the conditions in the lights of the Civil Procedure Code 1908. Here what I have done before writing the answer, I have taken the relevant extract from the notes above and I have pasted it here. That is in green that you can see. And then I have started off with my answer. I'll first sort of read through the answer. I'll give you the main points that I have dealt in my answer, and then I'll explain how and when how did I derive to it, why did I do this, that, why case laws, this and all of that provisions. So let's start with the answer. So first thing that I want to say, that personally, on a personal note, whenever I write an answer, I follow the IBC format, that is the introduction, body and the conclusion format. In the introduction, I try to introduce the topic, I try to give the relevant section numbers. If I am able to remember, I have a weak memory in that sense. If I'm able to remember, I'll give down the section numbers and the points that I would want to discuss. I will talk about the little bit of the principles, if there is some principles or anything that is there. Then I will go on to the main body in 3-4 paragraphs and then move on to the conclusion part, where in 1 or 2 sentences I try and condense the entire thing and put it down as a conclusion. In this particular answer, which deals with foreign judgments, I first started off that yes, the Code of Civil Procedure has recognized foreign judgments and these are the particular relevant provisions relating to the same. Then I talked about that foreign judgments have also been accorded the same status as a judgment of an Indian court, and it is subject to certain conditions. And how did this relevancy come here? It is based on the considerations of justice, equity and good conscience. And then I discussed a particular case law which talked about that by recognizing foreign judgments, it is not a derogation of our own country's sovereignty, etc. Then I moved on to the fact that before understanding, the question was asking about relevancy of foreign judgments. But first, before doing that, we should try and understand that what is foreign judgment only. So in the next paragraph, I dealt with foreign judgment and foreign court, because just the definition under 2.6 says foreign judgment is a judgment given by a foreign court. So what is a foreign court? That is under 2.5. Now in that particular paragraph only, I next introduced the topic for the next paragraph that will be talking. So I said that yes, it will be relevant and conclusive also, provided it fulfills conditions of 13 and 14. Next, what did I do? Next, in the body part, I went and discussed 13, that what are the conditions, etc. I listed it down. And then I also discussed section 14. You can highlight section 13 here if you want. Then I talked about section 14. Now, after discussing section 14, there was another part to the question which was talking about whether they can be implemented or not. I went on and discussed section section 44A, where the 2 modes were given, where you can institute a suit on such a foreign judgment, or you can institute execution proceedings in a district court. Now, I discussed all of that, and then I went to the conclusion part, that the code does recognize foreign judgments. Bracket, I wrote the section number given by foreign courts. I wrote the section number, provided it fulfills the conditions of 13 and 14. Then I talked a little bit of private international law, that it is private international states, what and all of that will operate as res judicata and all of that. And then I also ended on that it not only recognizes the same, but also provides the modes for implementing the same. So this was how I wrote down this answer. Now let's go into a little bit of detail. You'll say that you never discussed a case law in your notes. Then how did you put it here? Now this is a point where I would like to explain why I did not discuss case laws in this entire 12 videos. The reason being this was that it was my personal view. You might differ with it. It's not a problem. That for procedural laws at least, it is very important to first understand your bare act. And especially for writing answers, if you're even able to write what is given in the bare act, that's more than enough. The case laws that you write, the extra explanations that you write are a cherry on the cake. It's like you're just beautifying the entire structure by it. Even if I remove this particular line, this particular thing, this particular highlighted part from my answer won't be incomplete. It has all the points that it was asking for. By adding this case law, I just made it more presentable. So what is important while you write an answer? First first and the foremost thing, please remember to write all your points. I could have, like, it's a 15 marks answer, you see in section 13. There's a lot of scope where I can elaborate all these points also, A to F, I can elaborate them also. But you also have to remember from an exam point of view that when you're writing an exam, you are not writing a single answer. You have to write a lot many answers and not from the same subject. Like you're writing CPC, then you might have to switch over in the next 15 minutes to another subject. So in that case, it's not possible. Like it's a little difficult to retain so many case laws, etc. So that is why if you can remember the main concept also, that's enough. Because if you try and remember a lot of case laws, you might just get confused. You will waste too much time in writing one answer only, and you might miss out on writing another answer, and then you leave, and that will, and in such competitive exams, leaving an answer, it hampers you more than writing an answer without case laws. That's my personal belief and experience, that write at least first, write all your basic points, and if your time permits, then deal with case laws, etc. Like if you can remember all of them like this on your snap of fingers, you can go forward and write all your case laws. But if you have to sit and think, I will warn you that in a competitive mains exam, there's hardly any time to think. You read the question, you start writing. That's the situation that is there. Otherwise, there are chances you might you might not be able to complete your paper. So this is why I did not deal with case laws. And also another reason why I did not deal with case laws in this entire lecture series was that I did not want to spoon feed you like, look, this is a particular case law, you need to remember. After you have gone through this entire video and lectures, and then when you read on your own, you'll be able to pinpoint by your own self. Your understanding would be your understanding on your own. You would be able to pinpoint that, okay, I feel this particular point should be written in this particular place. I don't want to dictate to you that, no, look, this is the only case law that can be relevant. My answer writing and your answer writing may be different. You will present what point I felt important. Maybe you might not feel important, and something that you felt important is more. It's all about individuality. Please do not hamper your individuality in trying to follow someone. This, what I'm trying to do by this lecture, is just to serve as a guide that, look, this is the way I prepared. You can use it if you want, or you can modify it as per your convenience. So this was one example where I tried to use these very notes and write an answer. Now these notes that I have given, like okay, now before that, this was one type of question. Now there can be another type of question that you can remember is the situation based questions that you know. What you can do there, you first analyze whatever facts have been given in the case. First try and sort out the facts. If they are long questions, sort out the facts, explain, bring it down, identify the real issue in there, and then start dealing with the law points. And you can follow the IBC format even there also. And in respect of dealing with CPC for prelims for Bihar Judiciary, I know there are hardly 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. You might not even pay that much of attention. But for other exams also, one thing, there are a lot of states where they do ask important section numbers and order numbers, etc. That there is no escape, you might have to remember. But for the rest, theoretical, conceptual part, please try and understand the concepts. If you can understand the concepts, you would not need to mug up the acronym. You will only need to mug up what are the section numbers, when it was imposed, and all such small secondary things. You would not need to mug up, okay, section 11, res judicata, explanation 1, saying that da, 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 da. When you understand the basis of it, even though at that point of time, it's like I have personally experienced this also, that sometimes you might even black out in the middle of the exam. But if you have understood the concept, you would still be able to write something, or maybe you would not be able to write the precise thing only, but you would be somewhat near about the mark of the actual answer. This is why please try and understand it, and then try and learn it up or mug anything up that you feel that you want to. So this was it for CPC from my side. I hope with this particular segment that I have included, you were able to understand how you would be using such notes. These entire notes run into, I suppose, some 180 plus pages. There's still a lot of scope for condensing the same. And one more important information, that I will upload these notes. You can find it in the description box, that will be uploaded in the drive. You can go and access it. You can use them. There's still a lot of scope for condensing the same. Like for notes, you can reduce it down. I know before an exam, it's not possible to read 186 pages. For that, if you can remember, in some lectures we had done in a nutshell sort of a format after every topic that we covered. You can use that. I have not done it for every lecture. You can make something of that form, put it down on a piece of paper, then you'll have 7-8 pages of such sort that you can refer like a ready reckoner before the exam. So that is one way that you can go about CPC, like a very short kind of a note. You can use these notes only, or you can make your notes basing on these on this particular thing. This, we have come to the end of CPC, and I hope I was able to help you out with this subject. Like, it was my personal experience that I've also tried to run away from this subject right from my college days. But finally, when I did gather courage to sit down with and try to understand this subject, I just these three few words that were there in my mind, that I wish I had done this earlier. So this is just my little small effort on my part, so that I can help you out with this subject. And I hope I was able to do justice. If there are any errors, etc., in the notes that I am going to upload, that would be there, or in the videos, please forgive me for that. It might have been there. I'd have tried to avoid all errors, but if it's still there, please forgive me for that and make the necessary changes there, or you may point it out to me as well. And that's it for this entire CPC series. Thank you for all the positive feedback and appreciation that you have given me on different platforms. And it is not, it is, and please don't think it is like a one-way street where I have given everything you. I have learned a lot from it. It helped me go back to CPC, read it again, understand something where I had hazy concepts about, and also gave me a lot of courage and confidence in doing this entire lecture series. So this is it from my side. And if you do want me to continue with some more subjects, please give me suggestions. And that's it for CPC. Thank you.